We're live. Welcome to the Stories and Sips Friday night lock-in live stream. Thanks to everybody for coming out and being regular guests and attendees and fellow drinkers as we remove isolation and we have a chance to come together, drink a drop of whiskey, raise a glass together, toast each other's health, introduce ourselves to interesting people in the Irish whiskey world. Some of them are in the comments and some of them are right here on the screen. But we're going to have a good time tonight. We're going to drink a little bit of whiskey. We're going to open up a little drop of Aqua Vitae. Two great guests to talk to keep me company so that I don't have to talk all night. Far more interesting people than me with far more knowledge in their respective areas. My job is just to bring them here so we can have a chat and have the crack. So welcome everybody. Let me know where you are and what you're drinking. Great to see you, Steve and Ashley, Val, Stacey, Greg. Some hardcore Irish whiskey fans here who are turning up every week and also turning up to my tastings in Ohio midweek that I've been doing over the past few weeks as well. So thanks to everybody for showing up. James Kearns, good morning to you in Ireland. It is morning in Ireland, and I'm always conscious of how early it is in Ireland when I have Irish guests on, and I'm always apologetic at how late it is. I'm asking them to stay up so that they can entertain us all with the stories of their fine whiskies. So thanks everybody for joining. Stacey is drinking Green Spot in Columbus. Great stuff. Stacey, we will be drinking Green Spot tonight. Chateau Montalena. You'll be no stranger to this, having been to our Green Spot tasting on Thursday. So that's one of our whiskies tonight. David Hayes, good to have you here. Up the Rebels indeed. Corkman joining. So we're drinking three different amazing spirits tonight, two of which are whiskies and one of which is not a whiskey, but uses whiskey in its formula and is the inspiration, was the inspiration and was the forerunner to our modern day whiskey. We'll be drinking a drop of Aquavitae. So the first thing we'll be drinking tonight, once a few more of you join, we will be drinking the Liberator Irish whiskey, and I'm going to be joined in a few minutes by Maurice O'Connell, founder of Wayward Irish Spirits, who's going to talk us through a tasting of the Liberator. We had Maurice on our podcast this week and we had a great chat and was very well received. We're going to be drinking Green Spot Chateau Montalena, a fantastic collaboration between Middleton, Mitchell & Sons, and the Barrett family of Chateau Montalena in Calistoga in California. And we have Chris Hennessy, who's joining us all the way from Kilkenny, and he will be sharing with us Aquavitae, his creation, Aquavitae, which is an homage, a tribute to the original recipe of Aquavitae that was the forerunner, of course, to Irish whiskey. And he's going to be talking to us about this. And we're also going to challenge Chris tonight. We're going to challenge Chris on his whiskey knowledge with questions to try and stump him. I've never been able to do that. I've never been able to get him to not be able to answer a question that I posed on any kind of obscure fact on barrel aging or maturation or mash bills or anything like that. So hopefully we can stump him tonight. So if you've got any questions on Irish whiskey, on very unusual Irish whiskies or very obscure questions, get them ready because we'll ask Chris those questions tonight. So Stacey says her Liberator will arrive on Monday. Great. You'll be delighted to receive that, Stacey. A lovely drop of whiskey, and you'll enjoy the tasting tonight as Maurice talks us through and walks us through the Liberator, which is great. Evening, Ed, Johnny's Long Beach, New York, starting with Black Barrel. Long day may lead to a long night. That's what happens with these lock-in live streams. So thanks everybody for joining, for turning up again. I know it feels like we've been locked away in isolation for what feels like years and years and years. I'm told it's only weeks, but I've lost track of all calendars and days and times. But I'm finding a scheduled Friday night check-in to ensure we're all safe and well and able to count all fingers and toes correct is always a good thing, and it brings us together, have a bit of crack, and talk a little bit about Irish whiskey, Ireland, and whatever else pops up. So as always, share with me where you are and what you're drinking. We'll give you a few shout outs, and we're going to start in a minute by introducing you to our two guests. So Chris Connor is joining us in Michigan, drinking Writer's Tears. MP, good to see you. You're on John's Lane, Lustow, and Three Swallow. Great stuff. David Earls, good to see you. Thanks for joining. John Fleming says, best of luck trying to stump Chris. We're going to try very hard to do that, but you're right. It's going to be a tough one. JJ broke his only 2 a glass, so may have to drown his sorrows with a bottle of Red Spot. That doesn't seem like a tough thing that you have ahead of you now at all, JJ. Good evening, James. Stacey, of course, joining us. Eamon Hagerty. Eamon asks, what's my view on the Green Spot core range, not the single cask? So we'll talk about the Green Spot range, the third of our whiskies tonight, Eamon. So stay tuned for that. Brian Redden in Cincinnati is joining us. Powers 3 swallows in the glass. Great choice. Paul Costello's in Cork, finishing his Redbreast 27-year-old. Take your time with that, Paul. It disappears all too quickly. Mike Horton, good to see you from the Irish Whiskey Society of America. And Whiskey Piggy, the Florida Panhandle, is here with us. Teeling single grain. This is great. And Daniel, of course, from Cork by drinking 1980s Bushmills Black Bush. Daniel's a great Bushmills and Powers fan. Good to see you, Daniel. Thanks for staying up so late. Who else have we got here now? John, good man, John, you're here every week. John Maritko drinking a drop of bourbon. But you'll step away from the Kentucky liquid for at least 1 Green Spot. That's what we like to hear. It's okay to go and see what the others are making, the bourbon, the Americans and the Japanese and the Scots. But as long as we come back to Irish, that's where our real love is. Lorcan says the Green Spot Barton, Chateau Barton is a great drop. It is. We've got the other one here tonight. We have the Chateau Montalena, the Leoville Barton we don't have with us at the moment. Sean O'Neill is drinking Glendalough, 13 years. Lovely drop indeed. Cuivine has his Liberator ready. Great stuff. Morris will enjoy talking us through that tasting, knowing you've got your Liberator to hand. Steve says, the biggest disappointment since the coronavirus, Barry's not rocking the turtleneck. Yep, I decided the temperatures have gone up too much in San Diego. I'd be sweating buckets if I put the turtleneck on tonight. So sorry, lads. If you want to tune out because there's no turtleneck, I completely understand the numbers dropping right now. And you're drinking Bill Phil. Good man, Steve. Shane asks if I've gone back to the Bill Phil since I last had it. So 2 weeks ago, I brought on Daithí O'Connell to try and convince me and convert me to the joys of peated whiskey. He was unsuccessful. He tried valiantly. He tried very hard, but he has not converted me to peated whiskies at all. I will go back to it because I'm a believer that whiskey tastes different on different days and depending on what you've eaten and what mood you're in and who you're with, what's the environment and the situation. So I'll go back to it and I'll try it again. I will do my best to try and understand peated whiskey and try and enjoy it. All right, so let me introduce the 2 guests that we will be having with us tonight. So this evening we are joined by Maurice O'Connell, who is the founder of Wayward Irish Spirits and creator of the Liberator Irish whiskey, which we'll be tasting to kick off our lock-in this evening. And I'm joined by Chris Hennessy, who is the creator of Aquavitae, who is the whiskey ambassador at the Dillon Whiskey Bar, who is a founding member of the Kilkenny Whiskey Guild, and too many other titles to possibly fit into just 2 short hours tonight. Chris is an oracle on whiskey knowledge. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining me this evening.
Good to be here, Barry. Thank you for inviting us.
So,
good evening, America. Good evening, Ireland.
Yes, America meet Ireland, Ireland meet America. We're going to have a good night tonight chatting through the whiskies. Chris, I'm really excited to dive into Aquavitae. It's the first time we have had a non-whiskey on the Irish Whiskey Lock-in Livestream, but there's a reason why we have it, and it's got an important Irish whiskey story, so I'm looking forward to that. And I know that there are many people who have got very obscure questions ready to stump you on your whiskey knowledge tonight. So go and do some push-ups, get ready, get exercising, and we'll come back to you in a few minutes, all right?
Yeah, that should be good fun.
Maurice, we had a great chat this week.
We did.
I released an episode of Stories and Sips podcast, which was very well received. I was thrilled that people were so interested to learn more about Wayward Irish Spirits and your own background and what led you to creating it. For those of you who haven't checked out our episode yet, it is available on iTunes and on storiesandsIps.com. There's a picture of Maurice delighted with his whiskey in his glass. Maurice is Irish Whiskey's Wayward Gentleman. And that podcast is...
I'm not sure about that, Barry, but...
It was very well received, and no wonder it was. Maurice, a fascinating story. For those of you who are not familiar and haven't yet tuned in, I encourage you to do so. Maurice has a fantastic family history. Morris is doing some amazing things in Killarney and has great plans for the family estate in Lakeview Estate on the banks of Loch Lean. Isn't that right?
That's right. Yeah. Yep.
And the first, your first release, Morris. Pardon me. Go ahead.
Is the Liberator, which you have there in front of you, and I happen to have a spare one here. We brought this out on February the 29th. Maybe not the most auspicious time to be bringing out a new whiskey to the Irish market or to any market, but there we are. We didn't know what was happening. It was really well received to start off with, and we're very happy with how it's gone so far. We're only sorry that the ones that we sold into the on-trade, the pubs and the hotels and bars, they haven't had a chance. The idea was that we'd get a lot into those so that people could try it before buying it. So
yes,
so we're very happy with the way it's gone so far. And there was 685 bottles produced, 684 actually. Although the bottle says it's numbered up to 700, we couldn't actually quite fill that many. So we're coming to the end of those, and we've got a second batch 2, being prepared at the moment, ready to come on stream when we sell out of the inaugural release.
Very good, very good. Morris, you and I met first in Dublin in November, Whiskey Live, and Whiskey Live was where you showcased you were going to release. You showcased the Liberator and got people to learn a little bit about the story before the release. And I didn't get a chance to see you at the official Whiskey Live, but you chased me down to find me hiding away in the corner of the Palace Bar.
I'm sorry. Yeah, when you're trying to fog whiskey, you become shameless. So what can I say? Just
I appreciate
you
the
were
hustle.
there on your little perch in the Palace Bar with Barry Chandler written on the back of the chair, and you look well set in there.
There's nowhere better to be on a cold November night than in the corner of the Palace Bar, facing the crowd, as if you own the place, you know.
You will.
So that was the first time we got to meet, and you were very keen to tell me the story of Wayward Irish Spirits and what you were doing. And then we connected a little bit later online, and you were determined to get a sample of it into my hand, which you did. And I was so surprised at the flavor that came out of this spirit that I messaged you and said, we have to have you on. We have to talk to you. I need to understand more about this whiskey. So I'm delighted that we do finally have a full bottle of the Liberator here. And I would love, Morris, for you to lead me on a little bit of a tasting of this, to talk us through it. And I have some questions for you. And if anybody else has got questions in the audience, please put your questions in there for Sean. So I'm going to pour a little drop, or for Morris, pardon me. Let me pour a little drop of this here.
I answer to Sean. I answer to anything, so I'm well used to that by now. I think with whiskey, what's really important, what we like is the noise when you open the bottle, and that's part of the experience of opening it. And the cork on this is really satisfying to my mind. So that was part of the plan when we designed the bottle, was that it would be an experience to open it. And when you've got it in your glass, the color is a lovely rose gold color, and on the nose it's very pronounced, very intense, fruity, with some dried cherries, figs, citrus. There's a bit of cardamom in there, and what I like is the fact that there's still the malt in the background there, but the nose.
What's giving it that color, Morris?
I think the color's natural. The color is from the Tawny Port casks. There's nothing been added to it. It's not chill filtered. Just as an aside on that, just to show you what happened with the whiskey, that was what it was like after about 4 weeks. So there's a slight pink tinge. Then after 20 weeks, I'm lost video. After about 20 weeks, then it's this slightly pinker, and we left it in for 40 weeks, so it became this really intense red. That's been dialed back now by the blending, but still there's that fantastic color to it, and the nose gets me every time. I think that the nose is stunning on it.
Dark red fruits every time on the nose.
Yeah. I try not to say Christmas cake because I want people to be drinking it all year round. But there is Christmas cake there. You can't get away from that. On the palate, it's dry, and the sort of quite a smooth, mouth-filling palate to it. But there's a bit of a sparkle to it, to it as well in the mouth. And
how old is this, Maurice? How old is this liquid?
25% of it is 13-year-old Cooley whiskey. The balance of it is between 4 and 5-year-old Cooley. That sorry, not Cooley, Great Northern Distillery. And it's that element, it's the younger element that's been in the port casks for 9 months, which has given us this mad colour. So yeah, 25% 13-year-old, 75% 4 to 5-year-old.
Lovely dry palate to it, isn't there? There's that the tannins are very clearly evident in that on the palate.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's when I first tasted it, I was surprised at just how fantastic that port contribution had been. And you mentioned on our podcast that you were using port casks that were pretty fresh. They hadn't. It was only a few months prior to you using them that they were full of port.
Not months, weeks.
Weeks.
We had them emptied in Portugal, and they were back. They were here being filled within 3 weeks of them being emptied. So they're very, very fresh, and I think that's contributed hugely to it. We've since bought some ruby port casks from a wholesaler, and they've obviously been sitting around for a while, so they're far less active. I see that Stacey's asking, were we expecting such a deep red color? No, it was a bit of a surprise, and the color sort of came in gradually, and then it just started getting too scary, and we were watching it week by week getting more and more intense, and we've said, the flavor developed at a different speed to the color, and so we had to get the flavor right. So we kept it in as long as we felt the flavor was improving. So the color, because of that, became a bit more dramatic. But yeah, I love the color.
It's almost like a golden orange meat pink. It's a beautiful look to it. We had the Chateau Montalena at a tasting last night, and we're going to taste it again later. There's a little pink tinge to the Chateau Montalena from its Zinfandel. It's 12 months in Zinfandel casks, but it's clear that the ruby port is clearly giving it a fantastic color contribution in a short period of time.
Yeah, and I mean those spots are a stunning drink, and were a huge inspiration for me. And well, I was one of my favorite whiskies before I came to this. So it's nice that you've got them on. I'll open one with you later. So on the
Morris,
taste, I get
what's the taste you get on the palate?
so, on palate, I'm getting malt and hazelnuts, and then that followed on with some winey. The sweetness comes through. Then you get the wine, but it's compared to the nose, it's a much richer. It's much more fruity, but more blackberry than on the nose. To me, anyway. I mean, different people get different things, and I get some kiwi out of that as well.
I love a good wine finish. I love a wine aging. I think that wine and whiskey are great bedfellows and should meet each other more often. I think it's a marvelous contribution to whiskey.
Absolutely, yeah.
Sean asks, will you use different types of barrels in the future, Morris?
Well, the idea is to use barrels that have connection with the family history, and the family were importing wines and liquors from Spain and Portugal since about 1450. So that gave me the license to try the port barrels. And also, my wife has family in the north of Portugal, and and I've always been very fond of port as well. So yeah, it seemed like a good idea, so we went with that. We will try different barrels. We're already trying different barrels. We've got some ruby port barrels. We've got some Bordeaux barrels, and yeah, we're playing with a few others as well. So it'll be, yeah. I'm not quite sure.
The Irish, you mentioned the family history and those in the family that have connections to the port and wine. Of course, the wine geese leaving Ireland in the 1600s, the 1700s, traveling the world and fighting in the wars and eventually setting up distilleries and wineries and breweries all over the world. It's great to see that there's collaboration now again back in this century.
Well, that was the trade going in the other direction. They'd be bringing in spirits and wines and luxury goods to supply the gentry of the area, and the trade in the other direction. A lot of it would be young men going abroad because they weren't able to be educated or advance in any of their careers in Ireland because of their faith.
Right.
So yeah, it's so we.
Holding it up here, 46% there is the alcohol by volume. One of the questions for us. So that's great that there's family connections in the wine businesses around the world that you're going to be able to hopefully leverage and get access to even better casks than anybody else could get access to. In the Caribbean. Okay, excellent.
I'm not sure I'm not sure. We're not going necessarily to the chateaus with the family connections. It's more important to find the good barrels rather than family barrels. So we'll go for the best that we can find in the countries that we're connecting with. So.
Lorcan asks, what are the constituents that make up the Liberator, which I think you shared at the beginning there, is that there's a 13-year-old from Cooley malt, single malt from Cooley, and a 13-year-old single malt, or a 5-year-old single malt from Great Northern. And those are vatted together. And that's an interesting vatting. So we had this conversation, Morris. I believe that you're the first to get to market with a vatted malt. Could you explain what that is and how people might understand it?
Yeah. Well, it's the Cooley element was a single malt. The Great Northern element was a single malt. So it's two single malts vatted together, which to my mind makes a double malt, makes it twice as good for your money. But there's no such category within Irish whiskey as a double malt, so we just have to call it a malt whiskey. There is another. I think Pierce Lyons brought out a vatted malt as well now. I presume that was pre-planned before ours. So we're not alone now. So
It's interesting that the idea of a double malt hasn't existed in Ireland for quite a while, and mostly because there haven't been enough distilleries to be able to produce enough for whiskey bottlers and bonders like yourself to be able to buy from multiple distilleries. It's only in the last few years that that's been an option. So that's why a single malt has been the only type of malt in Ireland for so long.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And there's no reason why a single malt should be any better than any other malt whiskey. It has become a byword for quality, but for no particular reason. I mean, the blending together of two malts gives you the best of both worlds.
I think we can blame the Scots for that,
and
for marketing single malt as a way to get rid of old stock that they couldn't shift back in the day.
That's part of the joy of being a bonder and an independent bottler. You get the chance to choose the best from the various distilleries that are out there and blend it together. And it's the blending that makes a huge difference to it. And we've got a couple of blenders who work with us. One called John McDougall, who's a hugely experienced distiller, manager, blender. He's distilled every type of whiskey in Ireland and Scotland over his career, and he's been involved in about 30 or 40 distilleries. And he gives us a Scotch view on what a whiskey should be. And together with our other blender, who's a lady called Julia Norney, who's a Swiss-German lady, she gives us a different international side to the whiskey, and we sort of have a battle between the three of us to decide what the blend's going to be. I'm always pushing to have more port influence, and John is backpedaling on that. So we between the three of us, we come up with a few ideas, and then we have a group of what I call my tasting elves, who give us their feedback on what they think of it before we actually put it in the bottle and put it out there.
And how does one become a tasting elf? Because we're going to get that question. How does one get into the inner circle?
We've actually been very lucky because the family history has been a great door opener in Ireland. I found, and there's a lot of people like yourself in the whiskey business who are very conscious of history and stories, and we found that few people have been very engaged with our story and are prepared to give us the benefit of their opinions and time on for our blending. So we've been very lucky in the people who have been prepared to be elves. Though I don't call them elves to their faces, obviously. I sort of let the cat out
only on a live
now,
stream.
so.
And for those of you who are just joining us here on the live stream, I'm joined by Maurice O'Connell, who is the founder of Wayward Irish Spirits, and Wayward Irish Spirits released their inaugural release, the Liberator Irish Whiskey. And Maurice has just been hinting there and at the family history and how that has been helpful somewhat, especially to those who are who care about history and Ireland and the stories. Maurice's great granduncle was Daniel O'Connell, famous figure, mythical almost figure in Irish history, known as the Liberator, the Emancipator, helped canvass and secure religious freedom for the Catholics in Ireland. And it was drilled into us from a young age in school, his impact on Irish history, and of course his impact on many other figures throughout the world who looked to Daniel O'Connell, didn't they, for his, they studied Daniel O'Connell as they went about their peaceful means of protest and around the world, yeah.
And particularly in your part of the world, Frederick Douglass was a big anti-slavery campaigner in the States, and he acknowledged and came to Derrynane to learn from Daniel O'Connell as to how to achieve revolutionary change through peaceful means. So he had a big influence on him, and Obama was a big fan of Frederick Douglass, as have previous American presidents. I'm not quite sure what Donald Trump thinks of him, but no doubt.
Well, we won't worry too much about that. But we've got Ronan Mitchell here in Centra, Muckross Road, just around the corner from you. He's willing to be an elf anytime. So just keep that in mind there. Drop into Ronan. He'll drink your whiskey for you. A couple of questions that came in then, Maurice. JJ Quigley asks, would you consider single pot still in your brand, in your blends over time?
Well, the other side of the business, we have a sort of hybrid business model whereby we grow our own barley here, and that is made into pot still spirit for us. It's malted, small batch malted, and then distilled for us into pot still by Great Northern Distillery. And last year's crop was distilled in March 2019, and came back to our bonded warehouse storehouse here at Lakeview for maturation, and that is pot still. So we're very, very keen on pot still, and this 2019 crop has just finished malting and has been sent off on yesterday up to Great Northern. So hopefully that'll be distilled next week into the next batch of pot still. So first year we had 10 tons of malted and unmalted barley. This year we're up to 30. So we'll keep it at that sort of level going forward, and from 2024 we'll start distilling that grain on site. But that'll only ever be maybe 30% of the business. The balance of the business will come from sourcing and finishing whiskies on site, blending them here, bottling them here, and then selling them from here. So it's a hybrid of a distillery and a bonder. So
that's a really interesting model that shouldn't be lost on anybody. That Maurice has this three-pronged approach to the business. Right now, he's releasing whiskey that he didn't distill, and but it was distilled elsewhere with other grain. Now he's also got his own grain that is being distilled elsewhere, and eventually he will have his own grain being distilled in his own distillery, while also supplementing that with sourced product. So really interesting three kind of prong approach over the next few years, taking advantage of collaborations throughout Ireland. And Cuivino Muraku has a question which I think you've almost answered, Maurice, about how that spirit now is tasting that you laid down, that grain that you laid down when Cuivino was down to visit you. Is that it?
That's what it's looking like now. I mean, there's already a colour in it from these Neoc casks that we're using, which are Bordeaux casks that have been shaved, toasted, and recharred, but they've been shaved, toasted, and recharred in an expensive way, of course, according to the guy who sold them to me. But they're from a top chateau in Bordeaux, and whereas shaved, toasted, and recharred would normally be done with a flail. These are done by taking the staves apart individually and shaving them along with the grain. So there's still the grains are still left open for the spirit to be able to go in and out of the grain more easily. So that's what we're maturing them in at the moment.
Let me see. Brian Redden says that the landscape around the distillery looks amazing. Not yet a distillery, but a bonded storehouse right now. Distillery soon, but the landscape is amazing. Let me put up a picture here. This is the awful view that Maurice has to wake up to. This is the awful view across Loughlin to the Carron-Tool across the way there, across the lake. Terrible view altogether.
Carron-Tool's actually the other direction.
Oh, the other direction.
But that's that you see Inishallen and Brown Island there in front of you. Yeah, it's not like that every day, I have to say, but for the last few weeks it certainly has been, and we appreciate how lucky we are to be self-isolating in such a place.
Beautiful part of the world, even as a fellow from Cork.
As recently.
Yeah, I'm willing to.
Yeah,
well,
he says it's non-Cork, honestly.
Non-Cork.
Really.
Well, there's only two places in Ireland, Maurice. You should know this. There's Cork and not Cork. And
no, it's Kerry.
There should be no
not
further
Kerry.
Discussion.
Sorry.
Oh, is that it? Okay. So Tim Lawler says that the Liberator is probably the most badass name for Irish whiskey. And JP O'Riordan also asks what the name means. And of course, for those of you who haven't listened to the podcast that we released this week, myself and Maurice talked for more than an hour, had a great chat. I'd love for you to go and listen to it, where we dive into the history of Maurice's family. Daniel O'Connell was known as the Liberator, liberated the Irish Catholics from British oppression and religious the restrictions on practicing the religion, and hence the moniker the Liberator, which was afforded to him, and also the Emancipator, which are two great names, and also the King of Ireland. I think at one point was a name bestowed upon him too, wasn't it?
Well, actually, that's we're sort of playing with that name we've registered that name, and we're playing with that name for the pot still that we're producing from the grain grown on the estate. So pot still is the king of Irish whiskies. So we're sort of trying to work out, and we've got a few years before that's being bottled and sold. So we'll work out a decent name for that. There are lots of names that go with the family. There's Hunting Cap, the Hunting Cap, who was another Maurice O'Connell. He was a smuggler who built up a fortune from smuggling up until about 1820, and we might use his name in there as well. So there's a few good names in the family.
I like the King of Ireland,
including Ballycarbery Castle.
Oh yes, yep, the old family
exactly.
home.
Yeah.
So a couple more questions before I let you go, Maurice. I appreciate
God's
you
County.
staying up so late in Ireland. God's County, that's right. Jonathan has a question. Do you do tours, Maurice? He's in Killarney often.
For whiskey people, give me a call and I'll see what I can do. We don't do tours. We're not set up to do it, but I like talking whiskey, and my wife won't listen to me talking whiskey anymore. And they gave me, for Christmas, they gave me a little buzzer which goes blah blah every time I start talking about whiskey. So I'm really pleased to talk to other people about whiskey. So
Maurice's phone will be ringing off the hook now. He won't be answering it for the next 6 months, I'd say. Sergius from Irish Whiskey Magazine loves the bottle, very contemporary. I'd agree with that. And Joe Moore from the Dublin Airport, who joins us every week. As a history graduate, he has to say he really likes the idea of the whiskey, enjoys seeing history being respected and retold. And he had done extensive research on O'Connell during his studies. And he's hoping that this whiskey encourages people to look into his story, which is good news.
I hope they do. I hope they do too. And Sergius, about the bottle, there was thought that went into that. I was told at the start that you can't have a bottle like that because it doesn't look like a whiskey bottle. Nobody would buy a bottle that didn't look like a whiskey bottle. But what the family ethos has always been, it's always been about having the history but being modern with it. So it's modernizing the heritage, and that's what we've tried to reflect in the bottle. It's a very modern bottle. It's a sort of decanter, elegant style decanter bottle, but there's the history is there as well. There's the centuries of generations of family behind it, but with a modern twist. That's what we're going for. I don't whether we've achieved that. Time will tell. But
I love the bottle. Anybody I've shown the bottle to
was.
has stopped and admired it It is a striking bottle and really stands out on a shelf. So I think you've done a great job on that. A few last points here, Morris, have come in, and then we'll let you go. There was, let me see, Brian says, gorgeous shape to the bottle. Sergio says it is indeed innovation. And there was a few questions about where people might get hold of the Liberator. So it is, there's a few bottles remaining of this first batch online in Ireland, I believe.
Yes. James Fox, Celtic Whiskey, Carry Out in Killarney, who's been a huge supporter. I think he's probably on here somewhere.
Fleming is on here, he is.
And of course, Irish Malts. I just delivered them a big lot today, so they will have a lot of stock to be able to distribute.
Nice. So it is available. Last of the first batch. If anybody wants to get hold of Liberator Irish Whiskey, I highly recommend it. I love a wine finish. I love a port finish. This is an incredible contribution. Look at the color on that. Beautiful sipping whiskey, 46% ABV, tawny port finish, batch number 1. Morris has an incredible family history, an incredible story, and I do encourage you to check out our podcast this week, which is available wherever you get podcasts. iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, etc. Please go check out. We had an hour-long conversation where a lot of your questions that you posed here that we haven't had a chance to answer are answered on the podcast. So thank you for those of you who watched or who listened already, and thanks to Morris for joining us so late at night. You said you haven't been up this late in a long time. Thanks for staying up for us.
Thank you very much, Barry. It's been a real pleasure. Look out for batch 2, and there's a blended whiskey we're bringing out in a couple of months as well. So that's more of a summer whiskey, a much lighter blend.
Fantastic. Morris, Sláinte, thanks very much for joining us. We'll chat to you soon.
Sláinte, good night. Okay, bye-bye.
That was Morris O'Connell, founder of Wayward Irish Spirits, a gentleman with an incredible family history, incredible stories to tell. You could talk to him for the whole day and still not be through some of the stories. And I encourage you really to check out the podcast this week. I had such a great time diving into it. I'm as passionate about Irish history as I am about whiskey, and learning about the intersection of Morris's family with smuggling and bootlegging and the sometimes legal, sometimes illegal connections with Irish whiskey and with wine and port and sherry over the years was fascinating. So please check that out. So next up, we have my good buddy, Chris Hennessy, all the way from Kilkenny. Chris, you're very welcome.
Thank you very much for having me. It's good fun to actually be here.
Chris has been sitting patiently in the background there as we sipped, as if we didn't have a worry in the world, sipped away on a drop of Morris's whiskey. And we didn't forget about you, Chris. I could see you there waiting in the wings, ready to come on and educate us, give us some history and some education.
There's no problem at all. There's always a dram poured, so you can take your time.
So what have you got in your glass there, Chris?
At the moment, Aquavitae, just to polish back up and wake up the senses.
So Chris is the whiskey ambassador of the Dillon Whiskey Bar in Ireland. Chris is a oracle of whiskey knowledge. He plays a big role in the Kilkenny Whiskey Guild and is, I would say, almost single-handedly, we won't overlook everyone else's contribution, but almost single-handedly growing the whiskey obsession down there in the southeast of Ireland in Kilkenny. You're doing a great job at it. And I was lucky enough to come visit you in Kilkenny last year, where you introduced me to your own drink, Aqua Vitae.
Yeah, good fun to have you down. That was shortly after Whiskey Live.
It was before Whiskey Live, I think, maybe a few days before. I just come from Waterford Distillery, and I had spent 7 hours in Waterford Distillery thinking I was going to spend an hour there and come up to you straight afterwards. Ended up having to spend the night somewhere else and then coming up to you the next day. Such was my good time down in Waterford. But yeah, we hung out for a bit in the Dillon Whiskey Bar, and you introduced me to this little product you've got here. Chris, before we dive into it, tell me how you got involved in Irish whiskey first, and what's your connection to the drinks trade? How did you become so knowledgeable about so many spirits? So many questions there.
Yeah, we'll start with the first. Well, it started off a job in a bar called Biddy Early's cocktail bar about 15 years ago. A decade ago, we opened up a whiskey bar called the Dillon. So for the first 5 odd years in Biddy's, everything's cocktails, everything's about spirits, getting balances of flavors. So we did a lot of trainings in the different types of spirits, from vodkas to your gins to your rums, and figuring out what basically drives the flavors of the cocktails, what drives the flavor profiles to get the balances between sweet and sour, and always having a strong element and figuring out where that'll sit. With that, when we opened up the Dillon Whiskey Bar, December 2009, we had 84 different whiskies. 56 of them were Scotch, because back then there wasn't that many Irish. From Powers, for instance, there was Powers, Gold Label, and there was the 12-year-old blend. Right now you're sitting on 7-8 different bottles, but back then there was very, very little. Everything was coming from 3 different places. You had your Cooley, your Bushmills, and your Middleton, whereas we're lucky these days. We have 30 odd distilleries. It's great. But back then we would sit down and have a training once a week. We explored the new bottles that we got in, explore different spirits, bring in ambassadors from the different distilleries themselves, teach us about their products, show us back then personally what you have an access to nearly every single day now. But back then it was a month or 2 worth of organization just for 1 day's worth of a tasting and getting somebody down and getting somebody dedicated. It was fantastic. But the more you explore, the more you want to know, the more questions you have, and sometimes just reading the labels themselves won't give you all the information you're looking for. So it was getting those dedicated days with the different ambassadors and different distillers coming down and talking to us that really widened everything up and just got me curious more and more. So that's where I started anyway.
And you became interested in the history then as well of Irish whiskey, presumably. And being from Kilkenny, there is a connection to the origin of Irish whiskey, is there?
Yeah. So like most great things, events happen, but when alcohol are involved, sometimes we forget, sometimes we don't write it down, sometimes we hear it a little bit differently. So with the history of drinks, it's great when people actually decide to write them down, because then you have some form of a reference point. You can hop back and forth. In Kilkenny, in around 1324, there was a bishop called Richard Ledred. He wrote a book called the Red Book of Ossory, and inside this book was pretty much like a diary. He was writing down all his different notes. He was coming up with choral songs for the cathedral itself, so that everyone is singing what he wants them to sing. It's not being influenced by any other cultures or any other churches. He wanted full control over everything. Different recipes being wrote down for Aquavitae was one of the first, and that's how we got down this journey. There was a second one at the end of the book called Nectar, Nectar of the Gods. Nectar is basically like the first red wine punch. Red wine, heat from a couple different spices, honey as your sweetener, and that was used to open up the vocal cords of the singers in the choir and basically get them to do the best job that they could. Whereas Aquavitae was originally medicinal, and it was there as a help benefit. You would rub it on your skin if you had psoriasis, you would take it internally if you had any form of inflammations, and that was their cure-all. That was to begin with anyway.
So was that the first mention of something related to a distilled spirit that we would call Irish whiskey, or was there other mentions of Irish whiskey before that?
At this moment in time, it's the first record of Aquavitae being distilled in Ireland and in Europe. So the reference itself is not just a reference to the words Aquavitae. There's 2.5 pages of compounded Latin worth of a recipe. Compounded Latin is basically, if you take a 15-word sentence and you take away all the ofs, ats, thes, ands, that's compounded Latin. It's like 5 words is a 15-word sentence. It's great when you're going to translate.
So you decided you're going to translate these 2.5 pages of compounded Latin because you wanted to find the recipe from the 1300s?
Yeah, I got a challenge from Fionnán O'Connor to try recreate the recipe, and contacted a few different people that can speak Latin and got them to translate it each. If you ask one person, they'll give you an interpretation, whereas if you ask a bunch of different people and then compile that all together, you get the breadcrumbs to follow on the trail. You don't wander off in any direction.
Why did you want to understand this origin and understand this recipe and eventually release the recipe in a bottle? Why was that important to you? Like, what was the interest?
Well, after 15 years of cocktails where you're trying to break apart all the different elements to figure out what tastes like what and how, it leaves you very, very curious when it comes to new flavors and new tinctures and stuff. So one part of it was to figure out, when you're reading it, what it actually physically tastes like. Just like a cooking book, just like a cocktail book, when you read the things, you really want to discover what they taste like. And you always want to go off to that one person who can make it properly. You go to a proper restaurant if you want some good food. You go to a proper bar if you want a proper drink. With this, it was the question of, we know it existed, but what did it taste like? And how did they get from A to B? So there was the history side of it, where we have to bring something back to life. And then there was the adventure side of it, of what it actually physically tastes like.
So this is the product of that. This is what that recipe is, and it's called, you released it in 2019, Aqua Vitae, right?
Yeah, that would be after 3.5 years of looking at the recipe, reading it, making different tinctures. A tincture is, you take an individual ingredient, you steep it in alcohol, and that's an individual flavor. There was 93 tinctures sitting in my home at one given time. The first 20 odd tinctures were individual flavors, and then the next 20 would be 2 individuals put together and then 4 individuals put together to figure out, one, the biting point, where you're getting the most amount out of a botanical, and then the blends of them together is to find out the biting point of when, say, a clove takes over the heat of cinnamon, or cinnamon takes over the subtleness of saffron, different things like that, just to figure out where the points are of interaction that they'll actually work when they're amalgamated together. Very similar to what blenders do with a couple different styles of casks. When does the port overpower the sherry, and flavors like that.
So 3.5 years of experimentation, research, translation, formulation, no doubt, trying to figure out what spirit was going to go in there with all of the various components. This is not like any spirit or Irish drink I've ever nosed before, and I've yet to taste it. But this is, tell me what now has ended up in the glass. Like, what would you class this is? Is there a category this falls into?
Yeah, it actually Aquavitae ends up to be a category in itself. So if you were to do it properly, this would be a timeline pour. So Aquavitae comes first, eventually Uisce Beatha, then you have poaching, then you'd have whiskey. So if you were to try this in a tasting flight, you would literally go in that order. This would be the bottle itself. Yep. You have a lovely backdrop with mountains in the back, or not mountains, the cliffs of Moher in the background, but we'll do that with a lovely thing above my head. Yeah, so what's in the glass is a type of pot still. It's a 50-50 malted and unmalted barley. The malted barley is there to provide the sweetness, because this at no point in time ever had sugar. We use raisins for sweetness and the malted barley for sweetness, just to balance out the heat of the different spices and the floral characters. You have on your main notes cinnamon, clove, nutmeg, mace blades, which are the outer skin of a nutmeg. It's a lot more kind of a fruitier spice. You will have saffron. You'll have a herb called spikenard, which was the bane of my life for quite some time. Latin for spikenard is basically nardi. Nardi means grown from ground, which is every root, plant, tree known to mankind. So we actually had to go the whole way back to the Bible to figure out the exact origin, to figure out the exact type of plant. There's a couple different references in the Bible. There's a couple different references in religious books coming the whole way through 800s, 900s, up as far as the 1300s, where we could figure out which exact plant, which exact root, which exact bark. And then was one of the reasons why the tinctures took so long to amalgamate together is you have something in its solid form, something in its dried form, something in its powdered form, something broken apart, something slightly bruised. You to figure out how they would have had it back then, how they would have transported it, how long it would have taken to get there, all that kind of stuff. So once we figured that out, we knew exactly what direction we were going.
Was there a point though along the way, 2 years in, 80 tinctures in, you've read the Bible twice trying to find the root, vegetable and herb, where you said, listen, enough is enough. We can buy whiskey and drinks fairly cheaply in the supermarket. Was there a point where you said, no, enough of this?
Nah, too much curiosity. It had to be done. If you start a project like that, you have to get to the end. And we're about 99% of the way there. There's still 1 or 2 more bits on the journey between the 1300s and the 1600s that we still have to figure out.
Presumably the available ingredients in the 1300s are very different than the available ingredients in the 21st century. Were you able to procure all of the elements needed in Ireland? Did you have to have things shipped in from other places? How easy was it to find everything?
Yeah, all the botanicals come from all over the world. We source everything organic so that it comes in the same natural state as it would have back then. And because we're following Latin references, and nearly every plant pot you buy these days will still come with their original Latin reference, we're still able to find the exact species, the exact type, and talking to a good few different people who grow their own botanicals and who sell that kind of thing, they're also able to tell you if these variants have changed over time, or if you're sourcing from one part of the world and the same species is in another part. Does the soil affect it? Does the growth, the time, the heat, everything? There was a lot of time that went into that as well.
Unbelievable. I see some of the comments in here saying that people are incredibly impressed by the amount of work and effort that you put in. Brian in Cincinnati celebrating you there. Barton Jones wants to just shake your hand. He wants to meet you just to shake your hand. You're now his idol for this deep dive. A labor of love, says Jessica. Quiveen thinks apparently he has first-hand knowledge that Jesus and Judas enjoyed an Aquavitae of a Friday evening, by all accounts.
It was Friday night dram. It was the first Friday night dram. Tell Omar.
The first Friday night dram was in the Bible. Brian's wondering, so yeah, how many hours went into all of this? So yeah, you mentioned 3.5 years of a labor of love, huh?
Yeah, so it's not obviously every single day, but nearly everything we do from a spirits research point of view, you have things crossing. So one of the guys I work with for this, his name is Jared Cuff. He owns Off the Cuff Bitters, which is an Irish bitters company, and a lot of the history of bitters will actually cross paths with Aquavitae. It's all about individual tinctures being blended together to create a bitter profile. So he is a walking library on all things botanical. So and also he uses different types of distillates. He uses organic ingredients. So it was just a match made in heaven when the two of us wanted to work together, because his ethos was the same as mine, and he wanted this to be as close to what physically existed without standing beside the guy who was stirring the pot.
Isn't that another great example of collaboration in the whiskey world and in Ireland, of people coming together to share interests, passions, and then you've got this Aquavitae being the byproduct of great collaboration. It's always great to see it, and I love celebrating it. Wayne Sloan wonders if you can say where Aquavitae was made.
So the first reference we have is in St. Canice's Cathedral in Kilkenny. That's the first time it's wrote down. That's the first recipe. We have it dated to in around 1324. Ledred was in Kilkenny from 1317 to the 1360s, but 1324, I have a couple references of certain botanicals that are being used in this in Kilkenny and in the area. So I'm assuming at this point in time, until I come across something, another reference, that the reason why those botanicals were in the area is either to make this, to create this, to play with this in some way, shape, or form. But the great thing about historians that are out there, I know for a fact, eventually there'll be a reference that predates this, because he trained in Avion in France and his trainers were in Italy. So eventually there's going to be where he learned it from, who he learned it from, why he had these things together. There's going to be something. So yeah, we're waiting for that moment to happen, and that'll be great, because maybe it'll show us something a little bit different, or where this stems from.
Right. Connect the dots. What about today? Are you able to talk about the spirit component of this that's in here, or are your lips legally sealed about what's included in this? Is it just an Irish whiskey?
No, it's a pot still distillate. It comes from the Liberties in Dublin, and it's the oldest pot still that's being made in Ireland since Power closed. So that's pretty easy to point
those of you who know, you're able to figure that out.
I didn't say a thing.
Chris ever declaring.
No, Jared
so
has been working exclusively with them for the first few years that he was making bitters. Making the different tinctures, I worked with a couple of different types of grain, a couple of different pot stills, single malts, mixed grains, etc. Blended them all different components together. But it was the balance in between the malt and the unmalted that bring out all the botanicals the way I wanted them to. So if we fell on that for the flavor point of view, to highlight all the different botanicals that are in it. And that's what we ended up with.
So I just had my first sip of it there, and I've not had it before. It's like honey slowly moving up the glass. It's not it's quite there's a thickness, almost like a viscosity to this, and it's almost like it rolls slowly over the tongue, and then there's a fire from the spice that hits me on the front of the palate, and then I'm getting that mace, almost like ginger then, or nutmeg. I'm getting straight after it.
Yep. So because all the botanicals are macerated and seeped into the pot still for a number of weeks, different botanicals that we're using have different concentrates of oils, moisture contents, natural sweetness, and different types of spice. So ginger, for instance, will give you a lot of heat at the back, and that'll make your inside of your cheeks pucker. Cinnamon and clove will sit at the roof of your mouth, and they'll cover it in oil, then they will slowly dry out. There's more oil in this for the cinnamon than there is the clove. So the clove, as it dries out, will release the cinnamon. That warms up again. Once you adjust to the heat of the ginger, the cinnamon, and the nutmeg, you get the sweetness of the mace, and then the raisins will help come from the back of your tongue to the front and bring kind of a candied orange sweetness and honeyed sweetness, which is usually attributed to the saffron. And then spikenard is a cross between mint and lavender in flavor. It brings that kind of menthol warmth and kind of floral calm, almost like chamomile tea, that kind of calmness through, and it kind of eases around everything. But because there's so many different oils in it, as one dries, the next coats, next dries, the next coats. So you could sip this for about half an hour, and you will be able to pick out every ingredient, and then if two ingredients cross path, what flavor they give off. Yeah.
It feels like a tonic. It's almost like there's no illness that this wouldn't cure, I'd imagine, or a broken leg that wouldn't be fixed with an old sip of Aquavitae. It's extremely complex, isn't it? I can't imagine how you layered all those ingredients together and still struck this balance where there's no one that seems to stand out and say, all right, the rest of your ingredients, get to the back. I'm up here first.
Yeah, so what you have in your glass is batch one. And we did 104 bottles to start off with. Not for any particular reason, just that was the size of the batch that we wanted to go with. We wanted to see the pot still distillate was 66.1%. We add in all the botanicals at different stages, and then we draw off the liquid. And when we draw off the liquid, it dropped down to 55.1%. All that alcohol that we lost was through the interactions and the maceration with the botanicals. So we actually lose percentage quicker in the space of a couple of weeks than you would if you stuck your whiskey into wood. That's how much they interact and how quick they move. But you have the natural sugars inside the botanicals, which will lower your ABV. But the oils themselves become very, very dense and viscous, and they carry across all the flavors, and they leave it in a soluble solution. And then we brought it from 55.1 down to 50%. For bottling, we tried it from the 55.1 down every 0.1 until we got to 45.6, and 50%, ironically, being 50-50, ended up being the balance between you tasting the spirit, you tasting all the botanicals, and nothing being so overwhelming that you're missing out on something.
I don't get any strong new make distillate forwardness to this. I get those herbs and spices coming through, but in a lovely balanced way. It's almost like if medicine tasted like this, you'd be taking medicine all the time. You know, it's that lovely warmth tonic that just feels like I've just had the cure. You know, it's
yeah.
We're not preaching any medical advice here now. There's no medical advice, lest anybody think we're prescribing. But it's a lovely warm drop that you can imagine. It's to me now there's a taste of winter nights, yeah. Warm spices.
So one of the fun things about this, myself and Jared have a massive background in cocktails between us, but we always wanted this project to be just tasted neat. But the curiosity got to us, and we started mixing it with a few different things. And we found that if you're playing with citrus, certain botanicals come out. If you're playing with fortified wines, other botanicals come out. If you're playing with spice liqueurs and things like that, you can actually draw out certain flavors. But because it's 50% ABV, you never lose the backbone, which is this. And we tried very, very hard to put very heavy flavor dominating flavors in against it. It still came true.
Really?
Yeah, so we caught ourselves out with that one.
Interesting. It's the right side of spiciness too on the back of the palate, where I'd imagine if it was just a little bit spicier, you'd struggle with it.
Yeah, so with this, as I said, you have batch 1 in front of you. With batch 2, we drop back the volume of each botanical stays the same, but the length of time in which they stay in the distillate, we change that just a teeny bit. The cloves fall back by 12%, and that's simply just to change the viscosity of it, so that the floral notes and the subtle saffron can sing a little bit more. One of the fun things about the recipe is he actually says in it, because obviously the Middle East is very, very far away when they're getting spices to come the whole way across, that if you can't get this specific type of pepper, which was grains of paradise, you have to use cuba berries. Cuba berries are very, very similar. They're a little bit bigger, but the volume of oils change. Then if you can't get cuba berries and you only have a small amount of grains of paradise, you have to bring in, what are they called again? Cinzabaris, which is a type of long Jamaican pepper, kind of almost the length of green beans. Once he has this wrote down, he's giving you almost like a way of playing around. He's telling you, if you can't do this, do this. If you can't do this, do this, which means you get to play with the recipe. It's not, this is the one recipe, that's all you do.
Yeah.
So for the third batch we brought in cuba berries. We did exactly what he was saying, but this is slightly alternative. For the fourth batch, we tweaked it a little bit again, according to his recipe. So each time we do this, we're still following the same recipe, but we're following his advice of, if you change this, because we're curious ourselves, if he changes this and it's a different type of pepper, still a pepper. One's almost like coriander seed with pink peppercorns, so you got your sweet fruit. The next one is a very heavy spice like cracked black pepper, which would be closer kind of like your pot still spices. The next one comes across like a white pepper, so it'd be closer to your malt spice, and it's brilliant. Good fun for us.
Unbelievable. I can't believe the dedication that's gone into analyzing each element and understanding it's not just that it's part of a recipe, but it's interdependence on the other pieces and what's going to come forward. And that's obviously the cocktail background and the fascination you have with layering and complexities with cocktails as well. A few questions coming in there, Chris, about its availability.
Yeah,
this was released in November in Ireland. Is it still available, or is it come? Is there another batch coming? Talk to us about where people might be able to find it.
The batch one sold out in the first 3 days, fortunately, but unfortunately, because it's gone. Fortunately, because it got us to realize there's not so much a market for this, but it is welcomed, which means it gives us the rights to go ahead and keep going. It was appreciated a lot, and we appreciate that. But yeah, the second batch is out at the moment. If you go to Wine Centre in Kilkenny, El Mulligan's in Dublin, or Celtic Whiskey Shop in Dublin. And then at the end of this month, irishmalts.com for Ireland and England will have batch 2, batch 3, and batch 4, 3 different variants that are in existence. And Irish malts are great because they can ship to Europe and ship to some of the states.
Some of the states, yeah, Irish malt. So yeah, folks, look out for that. What I love about this is, and it's the first time I mentioned earlier, this is the first time we've had a non-whiskey on the lock-in, and there's a reason for it, because this is the forerunner, or it pays tribute to the original spirit that would have evolved over time, no different than Chris is evolving his into batch 1, 2, or 3. The whiskey we have today is batch 8 million compared to what this was back in the day, and I love this. I love diving into the origin of things and where they came from to see how did we end up where we are today. So I can't wait to try the next few batches. A few folks online saying that some of the places are sold out. Celtic Whiskey Shop are sold out. But look, folks, look on Irish Malts, who'll be getting the next batches as well, and you'll be able to find it.
Yeah, the guys that are sold out, Jared is actually based in Dublin. There is still a couple of cases of the batch 2 left that will be going to Kilkenny. I think that's all at the end of this week, and then the end of the month, the Irish malts will have the 2, 3, and 4. They'll have plenty of cases of that, so it's available if anyone's interested. And after this, when we go back into the comment section, obviously I'll be able to answer any more questions that we missed during this.
That's fantastic. So if anybody's got any questions directly for Chris, put them in the comments. If we don't get to them here, Chris will get to them after this episode. So thanks a million for doing that. So put this to rest, Chris. Did the Irish then invent whiskey?
The first reference in Scotland is in the 1460s, which is just a reference to say an order, 5 rolls of malt. Then there is a series of books in England in around the late 1380s. But yeah, 1324-ish for Aquavitae is the first record, not only in Ireland, but in the whole of Europe. And America wasn't that old, so you can pretty much say the world at that stage.
That's it. It's official. The Irish invented whiskey. I don't want anybody researching this further. The research stops here.
I will be.
Has officially declared it. And you can quote Chris in the footnotes of any articles you write. Reference Chris Hennessy on this episode, The Irish Invented Whiskey. I always like to think that I've always maintained, just jokingly and anecdotally, that the Irish invented it and that Scots invented whiskey 30 minutes later, but now it looks like it's a lot longer. It looks like it's a few hundred years later at best, or 100 years later that the Scots first mentioned it.
Yeah, as I said at the start of this, it does come down to the fact that when you are drinking, you're occupied, you're having fun, you're not necessarily writing things down at that moment in time. But the fact that we don't see the Scottish do anything until the 1360s, and again, they're just writing down an order for something, it shows that they've been making it for a while. It doesn't show when they physically started. So it's unfortunate for them if they are 30 years ahead of themselves, 50 years ahead of themselves. But in Kilkenny, luckily enough, Ledred wrote down the recipe and full-blown details. So it's great.
Evidence. Great. If you don't have evidence, you can't prove anything. So the Irish have the evidence. We invented whiskey, which is great news. Chris, thanks a million for sharing Aquavitae. An extraordinary journey of discovery, no doubt, that led you here, and then to have this seemingly simple liquid in a glass that is the most complex thing I think I've tasted in a Chewa glass is a remarkable tribute to both of you for what you've done in putting this together. And I'm looking forward to trying the next few batches and seeing this evolution. It's really great. So if anybody's got any questions for Chris, feel free to, about questions about Aquavitae, feel free to put them in the comments section. We are going to move on now from our Aquavitae, and we're going to do something that I've been excited to do for quite a while, which is to try and stump Chris. So Chris, anytime I'll post something about a whiskey or I'll have a question, Chris is the first to tell me even more details about a whiskey than I would ever have known, imagined. Chris goes deeper than what's on the website of any whiskey. He knows, he tells you what day of the week something was distilled, for how long, and what size shoe the distiller was wearing at the time, which is something you don't get on websites. So if anybody has a question about Irish whiskey, about the whiskey that's in their glass, about the whiskey that's on their shelf, and they want to know more about it, you want obscure details about it, we're going to try and stump Chris with questions about Irish whiskey. And a few of them have been put into the comments here already. So we'll start with a really easy one for you, Chris, and we'll see if you can answer this one. What is the recipe for Barry Crockett Legacy?
If you give me a couple seconds to ask Alexa, Barry Crockett Legacy, they say they use up to 25, 27-year-old pot stills. There's unseasoned and seasoned casks in there. The virgin casks are absolutely beautiful. Virgin casks are, the last time I was told a little bit in depth about it, the virgin casks are 10 plus years old for pot still. And the distillates that we tried that were a little bit over 12 years were absolutely fantastic. But when it comes down to it, Barry is one of the only people who actually know the exact percentages, and he goes into the warehouse once a year. Yes, no, yeah, it's down his rope out in front of him. Yeah, he goes into the warehouse about once a year, and he can pretty much take his hand pick of what it is in front of him he wants to put in it. He's there long enough. The casks are his.
Does Barry Crockett still have a hand to play in Barry Crockett Legacy, even though he's retired?
Oh, of course.
He does. Barry Crockett, of course, born in the Middleton Distillery. His father, Max Crockett, the master distiller, the head distiller before him. We have Barry Crockett to thank for the existence of single-aged, single-pot still whiskey because of his insistence on the distilling of it in the 80s and the 90s when nobody was ordering single-pot still whiskey. But Barry Crockett knew it was going to come back at some point, and luckily he was right, and I'm glad he got to see it. So here is the next question for Chris, and then we're going to talk about another whiskey that we're going to drink. Chris, why do certain Irish whiskey bottles have no age statements? What's the thinking behind this? And that comes from Shane Moore, a Dublin man in Cleveland, Ohio.
Well, Shane, been a while since I've seen you at Whiskey Live, but good to see you. Let me see now. If you take something that you said no age statement, take the Liberator, for instance. You have a 13-year-old malt, 25% of the liquid is 13-year-old malt, and then 75% is 4 or 5-year-old. It no longer matters the age that's physically in the liquid, because once you take older with younger and you blend it in such a way that you're trying to create a flavor profile, you can create something that tastes better than a 10-year-old liquid. You can make something that tastes better than something that has been sitting for longer technically in casks, because of the blend. You're marrying a lot of wood notes with a lot of spice notes. You're balancing out fruit. You can lengthen flavors and layer flavors a lot better. So Powers Gold label, for instance, no age statement, absolutely fantastic. And then there's stuff that's 7 years old, 12 years old, 15 years old. That's fantastic for having an age statement on it, but mightn't be as complex. So NASs are bad for marketing sometimes, but great for actual what fits in the glass.
There you go. We haven't stumped him yet. It's early days though. All right, I'm going to pour a whiskey, and I think you are going to pour something similar, but I'm pulled out Chateau Montalena, Green Spot Chateau Montalena. And I popped this open yesterday for a tasting we did in Ohio, a virtual tasting we did. We had 80 people turn up last night for a spot whiskey tasting where we tasted Green Spot Chateau Montalena, and Yellow Spot. And we had a fantastic time going through these three whiskeys and talking about their stories and the background to them. And I am in love with wine finished whiskeys. I'm not a wine drinker, but I love wine finished whiskeys. Now, this has been in a wine barrel for so long, you might even call it an aging, a year in a wine barrel. So this is Chateau Montalena, Green Spot Chateau Montalena. Chris might have more details on this, but I'll share what I know about it. It takes our regular Green Spot single pot still whiskey that we know and love, and it ages it for a additional 12 months, finishes it for 12 months in a Zinfandel cask from Chateau Montalena in Calistoga in California, Napa Valley in California, and Zinfandel kind of black-skinned grapes in Northern California. And that extra 12 months in the barrel imparts the tannins, imparts a lovely tinge to the whiskey that is very unusual. And as you pour it, you get a better view of that kind of rose color almost. And then it's bottled a little bit higher ABV than regular green spot. It's bottled at 46%. So a really, really lovely drop of whiskey. You've tried this, I presume, before, Chris.
Oh yeah, it's absolutely fantastic. Sorry, can't stop coughing. Yeah, absolutely fantastic. Like when they stick 12 months on the label to get the same consistent flavor out of the wine barrels. It could sit there up to 18 months. It could sit there up to 2 years. Each cask is going to be unique. It's going to add something a little bit different. So they want to get a consistency of a flavor profile. 12 is just either an average, or 12 will be a minimum, depending on which brand that you're talking about. But just what you said at the start, the fact that it's in there for 12 months, you're saying that it's a finish, or is it a recask? It's a question that came up on one of the pages earlier on. Is in Ireland, there's no technical definition of how long it has to be in there for finish, or how long it has to be in there for recasking, or how long it has to be in there to the point where it's basically a Zinfandel whiskey as opposed to it's bourbon and sherry counterparts. So it's always an interesting thing when you see the word finish or you see the word recask, because each distillery or each brand will manage it a little bit different.
They'll decide how to explain it. And Chateau Montalena itself is, you got a drop with you yourself?
I have Powers John's Lane.
Powers John's Lane, a good staple on an Irish whiskey shelf. One of the fascinating things about Chateau Montalena, this is the second collaboration that Mitchell & Son and the Middleton Distillery have done with a winery, the first being Chateau Barton in France. And these two collaborations are they're significant because they are Irish collaborations. Both of these wineries have Irish connections, deep Irish connections. Chateau Barton in France. Mr. Barton originally came from Northern Ireland, started a winery in France, in the Bordeaux region of France. And then Chateau Montalena in Napa Valley was taken over by the son of a Wexford man. Mr. Barrett took over Chateau Montalena in the 1970s, and his son, Beau Barrett, continued the growth of this winery. But the really interesting story about Chateau Montalena, and beyond the Irish connection, is that Chateau Montalena is the winery in California and Napa Valley that America really has to thank for the growth of wine sales and awareness of the quality of American wine. So if you go back to the 1970s, the predominant wine in terms of quality would have always been considered French wine. French was the leader in wine production. France was the leader in wine production. And if you wanted a good bottle of wine, you wouldn't have ordered anything other than a French bottle. In 1976, an Englishman in Paris who ran a small wine shop in Paris decided to assemble some of the greatest wine tasters in France and wine experts for a blind tasting. And it was called the Judgment of Paris. And in this blind tasting, he brought together some of the greatest French wines, but he also slipped in some Californian wines, which would have been very unknown in mainland Europe back in the 70s. And one of those wines that he slipped in there was a Chardonnay, a 1973 Chardonnay from Chateau Montalena. And on a blind tasting with these judges, Chateau Montalena in 1973 earned the top spot as the greatest white wine in the world. And it caused all kinds of consternation and chaos and shock and horror at the time that an American wine, of all things, the thought of it, an American wine could be the greatest wine in the world. And it came from Chateau Montalena. And there's a movie actually from 2008 called Bottle Shock with Alan Rickman, which recreates this Judgment of Paris. But Chateau Montalena put Napa Valley on the map. And if we didn't have this 1973 Chardonnay, we wouldn't have the growth in incredible wines coming from Northern California that we do today. So I think that's a remarkable backstory to the Chateau Montalena collaboration.
No, absolutely fantastic. Anything that falls back to our original history is always a very, very good nod. Knowing that I was going to come on this, but not knowing what questions will pop up or what exactly it is everyone's going to ask, I kind of assembled a few things around me. So one of the things I love, Cologne, their first Bonded series release which is a Jamaican cask finish. If you hop back through the history of rum, you'll end up with a load of Irish people across on the islands of Barbados and the islands of Jamaica working. Jamaica at one point in time, 1 in every 4 people were Irish. So the likes of the Montalena, lovely nod towards the Irish. The Oval Barton, again, lovely nod towards the Irish, and the same with the Jamaican rum finishes. When something isn't just there for flavor profile and it's not just there to add complexity, which obviously they do, especially that cask strength, but it's also a nod past our past cultures. So it's a nice one to see, and especially everyone now hearing and learning the stories that are in behind is fantastic.
I can give a picture here of Chateau Montalena that I'll put up on the screen for you. So there's Chateau Montalena in Calistoga in California. And again, run by the descendants of Irish people, Irish ancestry and heritage running Chateau Montalena. So even though a name like Chateau Montalena might not seem on the surface to be very Irish, it has deep, deep Irish connections. And if it wasn't for an Irishman, we wouldn't have this incredible winery producing such incredible wines today, and we wouldn't have this collaboration. What I like to think of as this collaboration of the 3 M's, really, isn't it? It's Middleton, Mitchell and Son, and Montalena, and those 3 coming together, 200-year-old stories from the 1800s Middleton, the 1800s Mitchell and Son, and the 1800s Montalena. It's great to see such a collaboration. But I have a question for you, Chris, and I know there's a few more questions coming in here in our continuing efforts to stump you and make you look like you don't know what you're talking about, which I think is going to be impossible. Niall Tubridy asks, he got the impression from Finon's book, A Glass Apart, which is the definitive book on single pot still whiskey, that Irish distillers, the owners of Middleton, don't finish their whiskies, but rather they vat different proportions of different casks together. True or false?
If you're talking about the likes of, say, Redbreast, for instance, where they have sometimes 2 bourbon casks for 1 sherry cask, and then you create a product like Lustau, they're taking different types of pot still. They're bringing them together in a cask to vat them, which means you're going to mellow out any of the flavor spikes. You're going to create a new balance of flavors in between. With Powers, for instance, you have first fills and second fills, and when they're being vatted together, again, it's to mellow out the flavors. If you go for, let me see now. If you go for something more along the lines of the Dream Casks, the second Dream Cask, which was a 20-year-old PX, you have 4 different types of pot still, 2 bourbons, 1 sherry, and a PX, and they all get amalgamated back into the PX. So technically it's a vatted malt, technically it's a recasking. It just depends on which stage in which they're doing it.
And different distilleries will have different, to your point earlier, will have different ways of describing whether it's a finish, a recasting, or an aging.
Yeah, just going back to what Morris said earlier on about the Liberator being the first vatted malt. They'd be the first people to openly admit vatted malt as a marketing and as what it is. But for the history of, say, Napoleon Castle, Teelings, who else? Tullamore Dew, for instance, when you're going from Cooley stock to Bushmill stock or vice versa or other distilleries, there is no point where you stop using one set of casks and then automatically go to the next set of casks. There's always a slight blending variation where you're bringing in 10% or 50%. So when they're doing that, Teeling single malt is malt from 5 different casks being brought together. The Napoleon Castle, for instance, is a couple different malts, and over time there's going to be a crossing point. Those crossing points technically are vatted malts from 2 different places. They just wouldn't be openly coming out and going, there's a difference today.
So how does a producer get around the legal definition of a single malt coming from one distillery if there are percentages of vatted malts in there?
Nowadays, it's kind of built into the rules, and we're looking for transparency, and everyone's being openly admitting what's happening. It's not a bad thing beforehand, but you will still have the word single because it comes from the malts come from single different places, and then they're recast in a single place. technically speaking, 10, 15 years ago, that still would have been a single malt. These days, however, everyone's looking with a finer tooth comb into what's being done and how it's being done. There's nothing wrong with blending. Blending is a fantastic skill. There's nothing wrong with vatting. You're taking something belongs to two different people and you're making it your own. Writer's Tears and the Irishman is probably the best example of that. You're taking two different styles from two different places, you're putting them together, and all of a sudden you have the most unique thing on the island.
I think we're used to those blends or vattings for blended whiskies like Writer's Tears or the Irishman, where we would expect, well, we know that Middleton doesn't make single malt and we know that Bushmills doesn't make single pot still. So we know that things come from different distilleries, right? So we understand it for a blend, but not so much. We would have historically been educated to think or told, led to believe that a single malt would have just been 100% of one distillery, not a few different distilleries that's then vatted in the one distillery, if that makes sense.
You know, that falls back to our history from like the 1830s onwards. There was, you could own a warehouse, own a bond, and you could buy from multiple different places, and you didn't pay duty on it in the warehouse. Same as now, you only paid it after it left the warehouse. But there was acts back then for people to be allowed to buy from multiple places. They could blend inside and then send it out, and it would become Irish. So if you bought, which was happening, column distilled grain from England, you brought it the whole way across. You put it in an Irish warehouse, it's still English, but the second you blend it inside the warehouse, your papers now say it's Irish whiskey. So like we've had, what's that, 170 odd years worth of blends happening. As time goes on, people are looking at it a little bit more. They want to find out what it is. And you end up with great people like Dottie in W.D. O'Connell's, J.J. Corey, different places that are now being merchants and bonders, where they're openly saying, we want to source from different places.
And Morris, of course, Irish. Yeah. Absolutely. And I think that, to my understanding, the phrase, single malt took hold in terms of its association with quality because of Scotland, but because of very clever marketing, because Scotland historically would have always been vattings and malt whiskies. And then when the Scotch whiskey industry was struggling as well, they had smaller individual distilleries were left with their own stock, and then they cleverly marketed that as single malt, as if that was superior to a vatted malt, which of course there's no reason to believe that it is superior, but it sounded better and it sounded more exclusive, and hence the association with quality with the word single.
Completely, yeah. Like one of the most famous Scotch whiskies in the world is Johnny Walker, and their black label is vatting of in around 40 grains and malts from different places. They don't have a distillery themselves. Right. They're sourcing, which you can compare to Hennessy Cognac, which is 40 odd different eau de vies being put together. It's using your resources or a library of books that's behind you just to build it.
Yes.
Still a good thing.
And Hennessy Cognac, of course, another wine goose. Hennessy from Cork man. Mr. Hennessy founded the Hennessy estate in his late 60s, actually. He was later in life when he founded it, so another Irish connection there. A question for you, Chris, in our continuing efforts to prove that you know nothing about Irish whiskey. Here's a question for you. Do you know of producers that have used a non-typical type of barrel or cask to finish a whiskey that didn't work out? What type of barrel, wood, wine, or other whiskey was it? And what did they do with the whiskey after they determined it wasn't any good?
It is very easy to, because things haven't left a warehouse, to blend things into vats. So if you have one cask that doesn't work and you have 200 casks that do, it's such a small percentage that you should be able to blend that variancy out. Certainly with let me see now, there has unfortunately been a few in the last 200 years with sulfur candles being used inside the casks to char them, and those notes being carried on, over peated, under peated. There's different things that would have happened over the years. Some would have been released, some wouldn't have, but there's not one that would spring to mind they released and there was something god-awfully wrong with it. A lot of people will argue that fact. You have the Powers 15-year-old, you have the Jameson Brown label 15-year-old that have such a sulfur and egg kind of notes to, notes to it. That would be Daniel Pennington that gave that to you, I would say, judging by the handwriting.
Yes, you're gonna talk about it in a minute.
Yeah, they're whiskies that they're only getting used to using column stills for the first time. They're using casks that will be a little bit more worn out, so they're recharring them down, scraping them down and recharring them, and unfortunately with sulfur candles, so that smell of a sulfur match carries through. So technically you would have things blended in, and technically you would have things released after the fact, unfortunately, which again would be the Jameson 15 and the Powers 15. There's nothing wrong with them because they're a piece of history and we can see how they changed it. So it's good.
So tell me about this one here. You mentioned sulfur notes. You mentioned the Powers 15-year-old black label. Most people will not be familiar with a black label Powers. What is this? When was it released? And what's it all about?
Okay, so Middleton formed in 1966. Late 1967, early 1968, Powers had put together the first gold label. You'll see on the records at 67, but it didn't really hit the shelves until early 68. And for the Italian market, you will see the Powers bottle is a different shape with a gold shield. And the 15-year-old was what they were releasing for the Italian market, the black label. And yeah, the Powers didn't have column stills back in the day, so the column still distillate that's in that would most likely be the same column still distillate that was in the Jameson Brown 15-year-old. The distillates would have either came from Bow Street, would have came from Tullamore Dew because Powers then owned it, or it would have came from Middleton Distilleries, the Cork Distilling Company, which could possibly be, but I would doubt because Cork Distillers had column stills for a very long time at that stage, and apparently they knew what they were doing compared to the other two, which were still infant.
There's the answer. You mentioned Powers and Tullamore Dew being part of the same family, something not widely known in the United States. I often share that growing up in Ireland, I wouldn't have been aware of Tullamore Dew very much, and Americans growing up would not have been aware of Powers. And there was a reason for that, that back in the 1960s, the Powers family married into the Daly family, which owned the Tullamore Distillery. And when the Tullamore Dew Distillery closed in 1953, the brand eventually became part of the Powers family. And Powers had control of the Tullamore Dew brand and control of the Powers brand. And rather than cannibalizing the market by promoting both of them in the same place, my understanding is that Tullamore Dew was shipped off to America and Europe and mainland Europe, and Powers was focused on as the Irish blended whiskey. Is that the story to your knowledge?
Pretty much, yeah. Like over the course of a couple boardroom meetings, they decided that Jameson would be the forerunner. Jameson would be the one product that all three companies put their focus into, and that would be the driving force. And we can see that today. Jameson's the biggest, so obviously it worked. Powers in late 67 decided to put a small portion of grain into their pot still to create gold label. So they have a big chunk of pot still in around 80% to up to 20% of grain distillate, which means realistically they need the grain to survive. They need the grain to lengthen it out, but they're using very, very little. They also had control of the Tullamore Dew brand. And as we know today, Tullamore Dew is very grain heavy in comparison. So it was just a case of, if you split your tendencies, Powers is a massive seller in Dublin and in Ireland, and then you have an export market, which is America, and you need a lot of whiskey for over there because obviously there's a lot of people. If you have a more grain heavy blend, you'll have more whiskey, and if you have more whiskey, you can satisfy that market. So that's how Tullamore Dew pretty much went across and became the bigger seller over there.
And now Powers is hot on the heels or fighting on the heels of Tullamore Dew. But Tullamore Dew has a massive, I think the second best-selling Irish whiskey in the world, and has a good foothold in the United States. Rightly so, yeah, great whiskey. I'm a big fan of Tullamore Dew. James Brannigan has a question. Do distilleries trade casks in order to get a stable flavor profile?
Yep. So Let me see now. The most famous one of this would be Bushmills, for instance. So in 1953, Coleraine Distillery started distilling grain for Bushmills so that they could extend their malt. Same as Powers, you want a small amount of grain distillate in with your malt to lengthen it out so that you have enough whiskey going forward for the volume that you're producing. Coleraine had an inefficient style of grain column stills that produced a very, very sweet style of grain. And unfortunately, when was it 1968 when Coleraine Distillery closed down, there was no column stills in Ireland that could replicate the exact same flavor, this very sweet style of grain. So the lads down in Middleton decided to put your whiskey through a pot still once, which makes it very creamy, oily, and sweet. And then you transport it over to column stills to make grain whiskey and finish it off. And you end up with a sweeter style of distillate. And that's the special type of grain that goes into Bushmills. So they make it in Middleton, but they don't age it in Middleton. They bring it up to Bushmills where it's aged in Bushmills and it becomes a Bushmills whiskey. And that exchange program worked as well. You get the Bushmills triple distilled malt, not aged up there, brought the whole way down to Middleton, and it's aged in Middleton where we get the Method and Madness Signet malt. That would be the malt kind of transfers. If you taste Jameson Black Barrel or Black Bush, you'll get a taste of that special type of grain.
So talk to me about this one. So I wanted to ask you about this. So this will be, I think it was a surprise to me when I first learned of this. Jameson Black Barrel is not a blended whiskey in the sense that we're used to understanding what a blend is from Middleton. So regular Jameson, original Jameson, the green bottle is a blend of single pot still and single grain. So barley and maize that are distilled in Middleton. So the pot still go through the 3 copper pot stills, and the grain, the maize goes through the tall column stills. Black Barrel, while it's also a blended whiskey, my understanding is that this might actually be the most Irish of whiskies to come out of, Irish blended whiskies to come out of the Middleton Distillery, because it is entirely made with barley, but it is still a blended whiskey. Can you explain why that's the case?
Right. So as I was saying, the special type of distillate that they're making to make a sweeter style. So this was made for the South African market. South African market wanted Jameson, but they wanted sweeter. And obviously, to make something sweeter, Jameson didn't want to add a ton of caramel because that's a bad idea. So they came up with 2 ideas. The first was to extra char the casks, which is called an alligator char. Looks like alligator skin. This will bring more wood sugars forward, and as the whiskey filters through, it'll become sweeter in style. The second is to use that special type of grain. And when you're using all barley through a pot still and then all barley through that column grain, you get a lot sweeter style. Outside of this bottling, let me see now, it's Slane are growing their own barley on their own land. They're putting that barley through column stills, which will be the same kind of style variant. And then they're going to put their own barley through pot stills for malt, and malted and unmalted, again from their own land for their pot still. So outside of this, that will probably be the only place you will get that style of grain on its own. I can't see Middleton, hopefully they do, it'd be great to see, but I can't see them producing that grain and selling it as a single grain on its own without any form of an influence. If they were, it would be a Method of Madness, and there would be a specific cask finish as opposed to just bourbon and just tasting what the grain tastes like itself.
And this has changed names a few times over the years. It was Black Barrels. Explain that I think there's 3 different names for it, if I recall.
So, yeah, they had a Select Reserve on the front of it, but the problem with Select Reserve is you've hundreds of different whiskies in the world that would be Select Reserve, rums, etc. You also have 12-year-old Select Reserve was on one of the bottles at the time. You had the Rarest Vintage Reserve. So you have to, marketing-wise, get away from those keywords so that it stands out. It became Select Reserve and the word Black Barrel underneath it, because they were explaining the reason why it's Black Barrel, charred, grand. And then if you are in the States and you buy it, you will see the exact same label you have, but it'll have select reserve on it. You'll also see that label, it'll say black barrel, same thing. If you go to the South African market, you'll see that label, it'll say black barrel, or that label, it'll say select reserve, but again, same thing. Gets confusing.
And of course, it does get confusing, but it is the same liquid in all of them. I think my understanding from talking to Dave McCabe, assistant blender in Middleton, they make that batch of special grain once a year for black barrel. And the good news, of course, for Americans is that you get 50 milliliters extra compared to the Irish in every bottle, and you also get your whiskey cheaper. Then you can buy it. Yeah, I'll rub it in. And Americans can get Jameson Black Barrel cheaper than at the Middleton distillery because, of course, customs or tax excise duty in Ireland is so high, and in America at least, that's something we get a little bit cheaper. Let me see. Wayne Sloan says a Black Barrel Old Fashioned is awesome. I agree with that.
Fantastic.
Johnny McNally wants to know how he can enjoy his Black Barrel and keep the bottle from emptying up so quick. There should only be one hole in the bottle, and that should be at the top. If there's a hole at the bottom, it'll drain very fast, Johnny. So watch out for that.
With the Black Barrel Old Fashioned, if you go for Turbinero sugar or Muscovado sugar, it helps play to the charred notes. It helps play to the sweetness without over sweetening it.
There you go. There's a nice tip for you. All right, so tell me about this whiskey here. This is a sample I got from, I'm part of the Celtic Whiskey Club, which ships me little samples every month. So this is Writer's Tears Double Oak.
Oh, fantastic.
Aged in American and French oak, 46%. Tell me what I should know about Writer's Tears Double Oak.
I hope I can remember this because I spent 3 days in the Berlin Bar Convent last year talking about double oak and talking about copper pot. Literally all day, every day. It was great. And drinking it. It's fantastic. But yeah, the double oak is, they released a cognac, or Dew XO cognac finish before they released this. So the Dew XO cognac finish is a single cask, and it is an extreme depth of cognac flavor in on top of an Irish whiskey. It has an extraordinary amount of spice, very, very good fruit notes. And that cask project that they were doing inspired them to do the double oak. So the double oak is, you take your normal Writer's Tears blend, what's it again? Writer's Tears is 60% pot still and 40% malt. You vat that into a cognac cask and you mature it for 6 to 12 months. You get the flavor profile you're looking for, which is very dominant in cognac flavors. But if you take that cognac finish and you amalgamate it back with your normal Writer's Tears in a new vatting, what will happen is you'll get a lot of citrus popping, your fresh apple, fresh grapes, a lot of the more flavors that would be associated with brandy as opposed to cognac. Sorry, a young brandy as opposed to an older cognac. The very light orchard fruit notes, the very light wine notes that you would attribute to white wines without the heavy red wine tannins. And that's the double oak. It's absolutely fantastic. And obviously you get 50 mils more than I do every time you crack open a bottle, but yeah.
That's Writer's Tears Double Oak, and that's available in the United States as well. I struggle with the cognac finish, on the heavy cognac finish. I'm not a cognac drinker, and I find it is, for me, almost too harsh on a lot of, whenever I've found it on an Irish whiskey. Are there other examples of cognac finishes that you like?
Yeah, so Teeling's Revival number 5 was a combination of cognac finish and brandy finish. And the cognac finish brought out a lot of the tannins, wood spice, a kind of botanical spice, that drier style of cognac. And then the brandy cask brought in the orchard fruits, again, the kind of wine notes you would get from fresh grapes and the grape skin itself. So the balance in between the two really kind of helps sell the malt, helps show the characteristics the whole way through. A great one is from Lambay. Lambay have both a cognac finished malt and a cognac finished blend of grain and malt. But the cognac finished style in which they do is a lot more fruit driven. So if you like your 10-year-old Bushmills, which is light citrus and apples and pears, and then you add that cognac spice in the background. It's very subtle, but you know it's there. It's not overwhelming, not overpowering. It's actually great for teaching you the difference between this is the malt and this is the finish.
Interesting. Again, we haven't stumped Chris yet. We're trying our hardest. Let me know what questions you have about for Chris on Irish whiskey. If you're enjoying our live streams on a weekly basis and you're watching on Facebook or YouTube, there's a share button that you could share this to your profile, share with your friends. I'd love more people to know that we're doing this every Friday, having a bit of crack, having a chat, bringing on interesting people, having a few sips of whiskey, introducing ourselves to new flavors, new knowledge, and new friends. So please share. You can do that even while you're watching, and let people know that we're having a good time here every Friday. So a couple more questions for you. Let me see. Barton asks, you have a whiskey newbie that comes into the Dillon bar. What 3 whiskeys do you put into a flight to introduce them without them running off out the door?
Let me see now. So the 3 that we've used over the years in the Dillon that have successfully swayed everyone always comes down to the questions in which you ask. Not to be funny about it, but finding out that somebody is a white wine drinker, a red wine drinker, gin and tonics, you can figure out somebody likes dry styles, somebody likes sweet styles. You can figure out from the conversation where to go. So there's a teeny bit of psychology in it. But the 3 kind of whiskies that tend to win everybody over, Writer's Tears Redhead, single malt, 100% on Oloroso sherry casks. It's sweet enough that you can sell it to anyone who has a sweet tooth or likes a drier style. It has enough fruit characteristics coming through that from the Oloroso sherry that it's pleasant and quite familiar. The second would be, again, going back to the Bushmills 10-year-old. It's inoffensive. It's very, very light, although it is complex. You have your orchard fruits. Everyone's familiar with either apple or pear. You have citrus notes from kind of a candied orange to lemon peel. Nice, easy, vibrant, simple. Then I always throw in some form of a curveball for number 3. The first 2 gets them trusting you, and then for number 3 you need a little bit more of a flavor bomb. So you will end up with a Green Spot Leoville Barton, a 12-year-old Connemara, because everybody says they don't like something. If they don't like peach, you give them something that's slightly in there. If they're any way, shape, or form intrigued by the first 2, Teeling single malt with 5 different casks going on, everyone picks out something different. If you find out someone has more kind of a favor towards, say, chocolates, you go for a Tullamore Dew XO because you have your figs, your dates, your rum kind of caramel sweetness. It really depends on the answers in which they give you. And the question, or when we ask the questions, always very, very, what do you like? 30-second conversation max.
Nice.
But from there, you can turn around. We have a library worth of bottles on the wall, and you can always pick. If someone likes nutty flavors, I have 6 over here. If somebody likes sweeter flavors, I have 5 over there. That kind of thing.
I like that you slip in the Connemara there as the third whiskey, because if you gave me that first, I would be running out the door. Even if you gave it to me the third time, I would run out the door too. No, you can't convince me. I'm not a peat guy, I don't know. I wish somebody could convince me. Maybe I just need the right teacher. Maybe Dahi failed in his teaching duties to convince me to his own whiskey.
Next time you're in Ireland, I'll sit you down and I'll walk you through a couple different things. One of the secrets to getting to like peat is the same as getting to like red wine. First time someone has red wine, it's too aggressive, it's too tannic, it's too dry, it's too bitter. Same with gin and tonic, same with things like that. But as your mind opens, you're perfectly fine. Something like the Bill Phil is a very light style of peat. So if I introduce you to something that's a little bit more aggressive, all of a sudden this lightness is a lot more inviting. When you try it on its own, the last day when you're talking to Dottie, you're trying it with very mellow, non-peated whiskies first. Right. You're getting accustomed to spice and nice light fruits, and then this becomes your aggressor. If that's your aggressor, that's what you fear. So you have to introduce to someone that's a little bit more intimidating. And this
sounds like psychological warfare and kind of manipulation on how to convince and convert me to peat. I'll take your word. Next time I'm in the Dillon Whiskey Bar, we'll do a. I'll let you have free reign over what you convince and convert me to.
At that stage, I'll have been in a warehouse a couple of times. There'll be a few different things for you to play with.
Caroline Brannigan asks, when did Ireland first start using Kentucky bourbon barrels? My understanding is it's the 1950s. Chris, do you have a different date?
Early 1950s, coming in towards the Cork Harbour, is the earliest date I've seen a record for. So the likes of your Cork Distilling Company, North Mall Distillery, they would have had access first, and then eventually that would have came up towards. They will claim they got the pick of the litter, which is great. But yeah, it's a hard one to know because in and around the same time you would have had places like Derry having ports that are directly connected to the States. And then you would have Cork, which is directly connected to the States, whereas Dublin was more going towards Europe and then kind of that direction. So it's hard to tell. Like, it all comes down to written records. Yeah. And with Carol Quinn in Middleton going through the records the whole time, eventually we will come across something between the three distilleries that predates it.
So, yeah, we've been using them for quite a while, but the follow-up question from Caroline is, do all Irish whiskies start in bourbon barrels? The answer is no, but it is the majority, right? Because we do have all sherry casks. We don't, not every, I would say 99% of Irish whiskey by volume starts in bourbon barrels or has some component in bourbon barrels, right?
Yeah, it comes down to the fact that they're the most accessible. The volume of them is the highest. And we're so used to them, not just by flavor profile, but by working with them and the people in which they're working with. Like a bourbon barrel's in around $110 for us to get, whereas a, say, Teeling single grain with the Californian wine cask is in around $80. Because they don't use them for as long, they have to go through them a lot more. A wine might only be in it for 6 months, a year, 2 years, and you're passing it on to the next place, whereas bourbons tend to hang on to them anywhere between 1 and 8 years on average. So it comes down to price, it comes down to consistency, and then it comes down to just what you're familiar with. We don't buy enough sherry, buy enough port, buy enough wines and fortified wines for us to have that volume of casks coming into the country. But certainly there's enough Americans drinking bourbons and enough people around the world drinking American whiskey for that supply to stay going.
I heard Ger Buckley, the master cooper at Middleton Distillery, talk about the lifespan of a barrel being a lot longer than many of us would think. And a wooden barrel coming from Kentucky, made of American oak, Quercus alba, nice tight grain, could be used for as many as 80 years between the bourbon industry and the Irish industry, and then after that again elsewhere.
Yeah. Well, if you're falling down to just Irish distillers, as you're saying, because of the embargo between Cuba and America, Cuban rum can't buy American casks. So Jameson will, have say 8 years in America, and then 8 to 30 years in Ireland, depending on what it's being used for. Shipped across to Cuba, it's being used for another 30 odd years, and then in Ireland, we decide to have a rum finish, so we take it back to finish for another year, 2, 3, 4, 5 years. So the lifespan and the mileage on a single piece of wood is actually a lot more than we think it would be.
And the remarkable sustainability of wood as a aging and maturation container is that every time a tree is cut down, more are planted in its place, and it turns out that it takes about 80 years for a tree to reach the maturity needed for it to be chopped down, thereabouts, which is a lovely life cycle of a wooden barrel. As soon as it's done, there's another tree has grown, ready to be chopped down again. And I oversimplify, of course.
Yeah, you also have the fun of they don't just plant the oak tree, they have to plant other different types of species to make sure it goes up dead straight and the knots are non-existent and the branches are high enough so they can get the length of timber. It's a fun process.
And that's almost a whole episode we'd have to do all over about wood and forestry and growing. And we'll come back to that at some point. But there was one question here about a liqueur that I've seen over here in the States called the Knot. Have you ever heard of the Knot?
I've been told it's a cross between like a caramel flavor and a kind of toffee flavor, that it's high enough ABV to be classed as a whiskey, but that it is so overly honeyed or sweetened that it's a liqueur as opposed to a spirit.
Okay. I've come across it a few times here in a group. Steve Smathers was asking about it. Likes it on ice.
So
let me ask you, go ahead.
Because it's if you look up a recipe for a Hemingway daiquiri, Hemingway was diabetic, so he couldn't have sugar. So if you take the nut, which is heavily sweetened, and then you have juice of half a lime, a little bit of maraschino, and some white grapefruit juice, that's probably a style of sour that he can play with and work with. That would work for the flavors, but it wouldn't be adding sugar in on top of it that it would become too cloying. He was asking the last day the two of us were talking that if there was any cocktail recipes. It's just one that clicked in my head.
Perfect. I have a question here we think is going to stump you. There's no way you're going to get this. We're going to test you.
What drink is he drinking? No, I can't say.
No, from MP, name all 11 labels of the American release of Redbreast Small Batch. And if you get this right, he'll donate a bottle of Jameson Gold to an Irish Whiskey Fans of America drawing. Go on, Chris.
I'm not a collector, so no, I haven't looked at the 4 batches in the 11 different places. I like it.
We've stumped him. Okay, we got him. Yes. MP.
Oh, yes. Jim McPartland says hello.
Look at this Irish whiskey world. Everybody knows everybody. Okay, I think that's a tough one because these products are not available in Ireland. So we're going to give you a half a pass on that. I mean, if you got another one wrong, we'd know for sure you know nothing about Irish whiskey. Let me see. Barton says the old lawmakers in the US set the new oak requirements to the casks. Yeah, wasn't that to protect the coopers? Coopering industry.
You have American forestry with American trees, American coopers, American distilleries using the barrels once, which means you repeat the process. So every single person who has a job has that job once. Process cycle begins again, you do it again, cycle begins again, you do it again. FDR was brilliant for that.
Special interests getting their way. Let me see. Okay, 1 or 2 more questions, and I know it's 2 o'clock in the morning Irish time, and Chris at some point is going to have to go to bed. It is. So let me see. I have 2 more bottles here that I want to ask you about. One you gave to me sitting at the Dillon Whiskey Bar. You kindly gave me this sample. This is Jameson 3-star, 7-year-old pot still from 1954 to 1962. And if we look very closely at the ingredients, malted barley, oats, and wheat. Tell us about this whiskey and what role wheat and oats had to play in the past and perhaps has to play going forward.
Right. So for some people, this is a touchy subject. For some people, this is innovation. And for some people, this is just history. So some of the origins of the word single pot still would come from grain whiskey, which is silent spirit. And silent spirit was made in such a way that they believed it wasn't whiskey. It was silent. It was sham. It was just tasteless. If you make something in a pot still, it's absolutely fantastic. And you make something in a column still, unfortunately, it's not. If you blend the two of them together, they were against this. They believed you were not making whiskey anymore. So they wanted something to be only pot still whiskey, or the style in which was made in Dublin in a couple of different houses. Excuse me. So with that style of Jameson, you would have a distillery, say sitting here in Kilkenny, and we're using wheat for our food, but we also grow oats and barley and a couple different things. So we're going to all year long distill whatever grains we have access to. If you go further up the country, they have more wheat. They're going to have more wheat in their products. So it all depends on which part of farming land is around you and what you have access to, which will become your recipe. So there is famous quotes from Carol Quinn saying that John Jameson had a recipe book, and each page would have different types of recipes, different proportions of different grains, until he got a distillate that was signature to himself, and 2, it would showcase that 1 year there was a bad year for oats, or 1 year there was a bad year for wheat. So they had to play around with the proportions and distill it a little differently. With oats, you would have the husk of the oat, which would help with the filtration later on if you don't mill it as coarse. Yeah, so all different recipes will always fall down to what's physically to hand and what's physically local. With the Jameson that's there on the back of the label, it specifies that there's wheat, that there's malted barley, that there's oats. It doesn't specify the proportions. Carol does know that down in the recipe books in the Middleton archives. With that style, the oats is going to add a different type of creaminess. The wheat is going to be a lot lighter in style. It's going to be it's going to let it be a little bit sweeter, and then the malted barley is in a high proportion. It's got real leathery spice, very, very fragrant, very good. With that specific one, if I can remember, every 7-year-old back then, you're talking single casks these days. So if you sold a cask that was over 7 years old to a merchant, a bar, or a bonder, and they bottled it, or Jameson bottled it on their behalf, then that technically is a single cask. So back then, each single cask or bottle that you have in front of you would taste a little bit different than the one up the road, one round the corner, the same as the single casks do these days. That one says between 54 and 62. That was the lifespan that specific label fell under. And because it was before 1963, Jameson didn't bottle it themselves. That was something that was bottled by a proprietor of some description, be it a bonder, a merchant, or a bar owner, or a shop owner.
And for a bonus point, the first whiskey bottled by Jameson in 1963 was?
Crested 10.
That's it. We can't stump you. Although I have one bottle left here. This is a rare one. I picked it up yesterday. 50, it says on the label. Maybe it's 50 years. Not very familiar in Ireland, I'd say. You've no need for sunscreen in Ireland.
Since this lockdown has fallen down, I have seen more sunshine than I have in the last year or 2 years. It's fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. So much so that, yeah, I'm going to go to bed, go to sleep, and wake up and enjoy that.
You should. Hopefully you get a bit of sun tomorrow. No, Chris, we can't stump you. You're an absolute oracle of knowledge, a whiskey knowledge. Every time I talk to you, I learn something. And I'm really thrilled that you were able to join us tonight. And apart from MP's trick question, nobody was able to stump you, really. And everybody got the answer that they needed to their questions. And if anyone has more questions that we didn't get to, we'll look through the comments afterwards and tomorrow as well, and we'll see what questions we can answer. And Chris, you're a gentleman for joining us. We have overshot our time. Normally we wrap up about 2 hours. We're 2 hours and 6 minutes. But thank you so much for joining and for giving us your knowledge, your expertise, talking us through Aqua Vitae. And I hope people look forward to those next batches. So Chris, I'll let you go. Thanks a million for being part of it. You're a gentleman.
Thank you very much for having me. Much appreciated. And enjoy your day.
We'll see you soon, Chris. Take care. Chris Hennessy, absolute legend, whiskey oracle. I don't know if there's anything he doesn't know about Irish whiskey production, and every time I talk to him, I learn something new. So there we go, folks. We've had a bit of a lock-in. We've had a bit of a session. We've drank through 3 different lovely spirits. Chateau Montalena, just finished in my glass there now, was the third one. We started with the Liberator from Maurice O'Connell and his Wayward Irish Whiskey, Irish Spirits brand. And then we had the lovely Aqua Vitae as well, which was a phenomenal journey through history and a labor of love for Chris to put that together. And so I'm glad that you enjoyed. I'm glad you folks enjoyed having Chris on. There's no way that I'd be able to share the kind of knowledge that man has. My whiskey knowledge would be 1/1,000,000th of what Chris has assembled over the years. So a good old time to have Chris on. And thanks to Maurice O'Connell for joining as well. For those of you who haven't had the chance to catch up with my chat with Maurice O'Connell from Wayward Irish Spirits and the Liberator, we did release an episode of our Stories and Sips podcast this week that I'd love you to check out. It can be found on storiesandsIps.com or all good podcast players. iTunes, Spotify, etc. I'd love for you to subscribe to Stories and Sips to get every episode that we come out with. Every Wednesday we release a new episode. And next week on the Lock-in live stream, we've got two very special guests. We've got one special guest. I'm not going to release their names yet, but let's just say they represent the #1 bar in the world. And it's got a very, very big Irish connection. So I'm about to wrap up here. Still a bit of daylight outside that I'd like to take advantage of on my pale Irish skin, get a bit of a color out there. And I'm going to sip on a whiskey while I sit outside and soak it in for a little bit. I'm going to sip on the remainder of my Chateau Montalena. So thank you to everybody for joining. We're here every Friday. I'd love for you to share this with your friends, share this link in your profile, and invite others to join us. It's a good time. I'm absolutely blown away by the interest people have in coming and listening and joining in. But then when you look at the caliber of guests that we have and the generosity of their time and their knowledge, it's no wonder that people are interested in listening to them. And there's no way that I could do it alone. So thanks to you for turning up. You're keeping me company. I will see you back here next Friday. And if you're not already part of our Irish Whiskey Fans of America Facebook group, I encourage you to join that. We're up to almost 4,500 fans of Irish whiskey in there. You don't have to be in America to join it. You can join in the conversation, and there's great conversation happening in there. I'd love to see you in there. Just search for Irish Whiskey Fans of America on Facebook. So until next week, slán to everybody. Thanks for joining. It's been a great old time, and I'll see you again next week. Stay safe, wash your hands, and drink Irish whiskey. Slán to.